Dear colleagues, welcome to our monthly dialogue. As you know very well by now, these are Socratic dialogues among editors, important guests, and all of you. It's an interactive webinar, and I invite you to really be present with questions. You can ask questions, or you can write your questions in the chat, and we will be happy to address your questions. As you know, this webinar is live streamed in YouTube and also in our Twitter account. And now let's come to this important dialogue. Important because we have a famous guest, is Professor William McKenna from London. And I will host him with Professor John Cleland, who is associate editor of the deputy editor of the European Heart Journal. And the topic is extremely interesting: cardiomyopathies from ECG to genes. And you will see this story narrated by Bill will be really fascinating, extremely involving. And now I ask John to introduce officially Professor McKenna to our dialogue. Please, John.
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Bill. I think we all know him as Bill, Professor Bill McKenna, who I had the pleasure of working with at the Hammersmith Hospital many years ago. Currently, he's Emeritus Professor of Cardiology at the University College in London and Emeritus British Heart Foundation Chair of Molecular Cardiovascular Sciences. He's also a visiting research scientist in the University of La Coruña. He graduated first from Yale in the 1960s and subsequently did his medical degree at McGill University in Canada before coming to London in the 1980s. He's one of the founding fathers of the use of genetics for the diagnosis and management of myocardial disease. His work has contributed to the identification and disease-causing genes in hypertrophic and arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathies, and he's helped in establishing new diagnostic criteria within the context of familial disease. He's also developed algorithms to identify patients at high risk of sudden death. He's published almost 1,000 papers and book chapters. He has an H-index of 140. He's been given many awards and medals for international societies, including a silver medal from the ESC in 2007. Perhaps it's time for an upgrade. Hugh Watkins and Perry Elliott were both Bill's students, so his career and legacy continues to flourish. So turning now to Bill and giving him a chance to tell his story. You were born in Canada, but what brought you to Hammersmith and London and the rest of your career?
I think slightly serendipitous. I was going to be a chest fellow at McGill, and I'd been married about 3 years, and I'd been largely, for circumstances unusual, you're supposed to be on call at 1 and 4, and I was on about 1 and 2 for 2 years. And as the chest fellow, you were in charge of basically it was a tuberculosis, but a chest hospital. And I knew I was going to be on call more than 1 and 2. I hadn't met my wife very much in the 3 years we've been married. I thought we need an escape, and I knew I didn't know any cardiology. So I thought if I go to London, we have a year, learn some cardiology, come back as a chest fellow. So I wrote to John Goodwin at the Hammersmith, people at Karolinska, and people at Salpetri, and John Goodwin answered first. So slightly by chance that I ended up in London.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. And I guess it was from John Goodwin that you developed your interest in the cardiomyopathies, and it would be very interesting to get some of your early experience of that and what John Goodwin thought about cardiomyopathies as a concept.
When I arrived, the first thing he said was, "Yeah, you've brought your own money." And, and this was July 1976, so there were national health system cuts, service cuts, and he'd lost his registrar, and if you couldn't replace them, but he had clinics of 70, 80 people. And for me, coming from Montreal, where cardiology clinic was ischemic heart disease, valve disease, and hypertension, the Hammersmith hypertension was done by clinical pharmacology, And John Goodwin's clinic was sarcoidosis, amyloidosis, cardiomyopathies, Eisenmenger's, and very little coronary artery disease. And it was fascinating. And it was stuff that you sort of had to go back as a typical kind of intern resident coming from North America. You had to go back to the textbooks to find out about these diseases. But it was fascinating.
Yeah. So John Goodwin proposed the classification of cardiomyopathies, which we substantially still follow. Do you remember more about that first meeting and more about what his thoughts about cardiomyopathy, this strange disease was?
Well, his main concern was when he said, "You brought your own money," and I said, "Well, actual fact, no. The junior doctors went on strike in Quebec, and I had planned to come here, paid 90% of my salary by the Quebec government, and in return, you had to give them as many years as you were away. You had to give them the chance to send you." Usually to sort of northern places in either the Arctic or northern Quebec. And I'd worked in Frobisher Bay at this Eastern Arctic is managed medically supported by the McGill Teaching Hospital. And that had been a fascinating experience. I thought, I could get a year or two salary from the government. If they want to send me to Chibougamau or wherever, somewhere up north, that's fine. But 3 weeks before we were due to come, the interns went on strike. And the government, as a negotiating tactic, canceled all grants, and it affected one couple in the province, me. And so we came with no money, and I came with a small stipend from my grandfather's estate. But we became vegetarian, not by choice. We had bean sprouts growing, and I made the bread and yogurt cultures. And when somebody from North America said, "Can we take you out to dinner?" It's the first time I see meat and fish in 3 months. Yes, please. Yeah. So that was John Goodwin's main concern. And he said, "You can work in the clinics." And I worked the better part of a year as the European coronary artery bypass trial registrar. But I basically had no salary for almost 9 months. But it was a great time. And you began, I didn't actually see that. I was working mainly in the European coronary artery bypass trial. The clinical work started when I got a registrar job with the cardiomyopathies mainly.
So, Filippo?
Yeah. Well, yes, Bill, that was really an exciting time at Hammersmith Hospital. It was, at that time, one of the most important hospitals in Europe, and really a lot of action. We shared our office for some years, and we also had the opportunity to meet really interesting colleagues, starting with Kim Fox, past president of the European Society of Cardiology, and my predecessor as editor-in-chief of the European Journal. John Cleland was there, and John Dimbild also, and also other Andrew Selwyn, and other really famous colleagues. A very stimulating atmosphere. What do you remember of that period, and what influenced your life mostly?
Well, the Hammersmith was at one level was a bit of a three-ring circus because you had 4 or 5 very powerful bosses. So you had Attilio Mazzari with his interest in, at that time, spasm, but vascular disease, coronary disease. And then you had John Goodwin, interest in cardiomyopathy. Dennis Crickler was the editor of the British Heart Journal at that time with an interest in electrophysiology. And then you had Celia Oakley, who was basically multi-talented and multi-opinionated with good opinions on almost everything. So coming from Canada without a proper job and trying to see John Goodwin and Celia Oakley's patients in Attilio Mazzari's territory in terms of space, cath lab, exercise facilities, Holter facilities, but needing Dr. Crickler for support in terms of publishing, and it particularly related to the arrhythmia, which was a major focus. It was a little bit of a balancing act in the early years of trying to keep people happy and survive in the midst of an interesting collection of senior people. And then you mentioned, there's Andrew Selwyn with positron emission tomography, and I had a 5-year medical research council grant to do positron emission tomography in Hokum, which I did with Andrew, and he was a character. He went off with Brownwell to Boston in the middle of all this. Kim Fox was obviously Kim orchestrating and running. He was the sort of senior registrar, and Attilio, after Jack Schillingford retired, there was a sort of interregnum when Professor Masri was still partly in Pisa, partly at the Hammersmith, and Kim was in many ways running the show. And John Deanfield, as we all know, a multi-talented pediatric cardiologist, but also ischemic heart disease and prevention, and has the capacity to be an expert in many things. So there was a collection of very interesting people, and then more quiet individuals, Edward Rowland with electrophysiology, again, real quality across the board in that group. So if you look, as you pointed out, if you look at where people have ended up, every one of them has been a leader in some area of their work. And then that's not to mention the people that Attilio brought, like yourself, who similarly have done very well. But the other aspect of survival, Filippo, was we shared an office, and we won't get into names, but we shared an office with 5 other people, 2 of whom smoked a total of about 5 packets of cigarettes a day. So the survival was, as a Canadian, I would just open the window, but both of them wore 3 layers of cashmere and didn't like the cold weather. So to get the smoke out of the room, and it was a sort of a deal. You stop smoking, we'll close the windows.
So that was the incredible atmosphere at Hammersmith Hospital. But I think it was amazing to have these 3 giants with us, John Goodwin, Attilio Masri, and Celia Oakley. Also because they had really different talents. Celia was a spectacular clinician, incredibly knowledge. At the other extreme, Attilio was really an excellent researcher, very creative with proposing new ideas, new hypotheses to test. And John Goodwin was a bit in the middle, wonderful clinician. And also, as we said before, he proposed a classification based on clinical observations, clinical ground, which is still really extremely important. So I had this feeling to be lucky because we had these different giants with us. Do you have the same feelings?
Yeah, I mean, you could tell stories about any one of them, but I mean, Celia, I remember going to ECHO meetings with Celia, and the visiting ECHO fellow would say, it's a secundum ASD. And Celia said, no, it's an AV canal. And they said, no, on the echo, we've done this. She said, go back and do your echo. I've examined the patient. This is an AV canal. And she was usually right. And so this was early days of echo, but she was very great clinician, very, very quick, and very, very good with the patients clinically. Other side, you had Attilio, and I remember Andrew Selwyn was sort of the lead of the positron program, positron emission tomography program. But there was an Australian research fellow, Roger Allen, and they were trying to validate, I think it was rubidium blood flow measurements, which you couldn't make blood flow measurements in man directly. And they were trying, other than directly, so they were doing microspheres in the dogs, and then in the dog we were doing the rubidium positron to correlate. And we spent, I remember it was the Wimbledon weekend, we spent the whole weekend doing these calculations, because the software didn't have the calculations in it at that time. And we ended up with a straight line with an R value of 0.96. There were about 10 or 11 points on the line. And there was one outlier. And we were very proud of the fact that we'd shown correlation with a non-invasive technique to measure myocardial blood flow. And Attilio was only interested in who was the outlier. Why is there one outlier? He wasn't interested in our R value. He said, that dog is interesting. What is it about that dog? And it's a very interesting lesson, because that's, in many ways, you compare the group, but the outliers are sometimes much more interesting. But each of them in their own way were outstanding characters.
I still remember when we performed with Graham Davis coronary angiography in a seal to study microcirculation.
Yeah.
We brought the seal at night. I mean, really a secret to study microcirculation. Really, many crazy ideas, a lot of enthusiasm. And I still remember John Goodwin. I was an extraordinary person. For me, it's been a continuous source of inspiration. And once he said, well, if you assess an ECG and it's funny, if it is a funny ECG, always think of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. A very, very, very simple observation, but also we know now very true. And now, okay, now the title of our conversation, of our dialogue today is cardiomyopathy from ECG to genes. John, please.
Yeah.
Let's come back to science.
Yeah, let's we've learned a little bit about how you got to where you are, but what do you feel most proud of? What do you think were your most fundamental and personally greatest achievements, apart from your family, that is?
That's a good after comment. And so I think, basically where most of us are clinicians and we use the technologies that we can avail and are not usually that involved in the development of the technology. So for me doing research, I came along, I guess, in the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and the cardiomyopathies, mainly diagnosed in the early 60s. And that was Eugene Brownwald and Goodwin and people like Doug Weigel in Canada. And it was mainly angiograms, hemodynamics, ECGs. I came along at the Hammersmith in 76. And it was still, you still had annual catheters on hypertrophs in 1975, 76. But the ECG was particularly important. It was the simplest and remains in many ways a simple and, normal, abnormal. You can be a great expert, but is it normal or is it abnormal? Then if it's abnormal, you can get opinions, and that was a key thing. With the research, it was really applying technologies that were made available to us. So it was M-mode echo and then 2D echo, and at the same time Holter monitoring. I can remember sitting in the basement of the Collier building at the Hammersmith with a reel-to-wear Delmar set up and finding, that actually about every fourth patient has non-sustained VT. And they seem to be all right without problems, but this is surprising. And that turned out to be important. I guess the next major thing was actually the genetics. And that's when life changed, because everything else was phenotyping. The genetics was actually the beginning of some basic understanding of what this disease is about. And I remember when I presented once in Pisa to Schiaffino, I think that was his name, he was a professor of muscle physiology. And when I said what the gene was, he said, "I don't believe that's compatible with life." And he was a myosin expert, and it was beta-myosin heavy chain. So I just really have applied the technologies that were available, and then MRI, but applied the technologies that were available in the era. Obviously, the genetics was special for many reasons because of the people involved. But even going back to Montreal, I mentioned I was going to be a chest fellow, and the chest fellow was actually very competitive. It was an important job in the system, and the boss was a man called Peter Paré, who was a preeminent chest physician in Canada and in North America. And he had seen in 1958 or late 50s a young man, a 17-year-old with chest pain, breathlessness, and syncope, and he'd studied the family, and that was familial. He published this as familial cardiovascular dysplasia in the American Journal of Medicine in 1961. That remains a classic paper. And I grew up, that family came from a village on the Vermont-Quebec border, so right border of Canada and the States. And our family were from there. This family were from Coaticook, the same place. And I knew about the family from playing hockey. I knew about them, the sudden death, and I knew about them from being an intern in a hospital where they'd been studied and published from. And when I was I was at the Hammersmith when Peter Paré retired, which was 17 years later. He wrote to John Goodwin and said, I realize you're interested in cardiomyopathy. I have this valuable family. If you would like to study them genetically, I can, facilitate this. And Goodwin was just retiring, and he gave me the letter. And for me, this was a conflict. It was a great opportunity, but it was a conflict because Peter Paré, when I left to go to England, he wasn't happy. He said, you were the chest fellow, you were appointed, you can't just tell us you're leaving for a year. Well, I didn't just leave for a year, I left for 40 years. So I knew my name was mud to go back to Peter Paré. And not only, in Montreal is a small community. It's 80% French, 20% English, and the English know each other, and particularly the physician. So we knew the Parés, we knew all the Paris and their kids. So I was very reticent to go back to him and say, I'd love to study the family with you. He never said a word. So he set up for us to study the family at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. His wife, they brought out Polaroid photographs from the original in the late 50s. And his wife greeted all the family on the doorsteps of the hospital. We studied them on a Saturday and Sunday. And he had Cricket Zeidman and me come to his place in the Laurentians, which is sort of small hills. And yeah, it was a wonderful experience. And obviously finding the first linkage to I wasn't sure it was alpha or beta myosin, but then on chromosome 14, and then finding the gene. So that very exciting to understand and be part of. And our training, I had no training in genetics. I mean, Cricket and John, whatever I knew, I learned from those two, and I would go over once, usually about every 6 weeks for 4 or 5 days to Boston, usually carrying bloods from other families. But that finding the gene and being involved in the genetics was exciting, and still is. That's where the excitement is today. Yeah.
And I can remember, a lot of your early screening programs and trying to get these people with very early or subtle phenotypes and so on. So, yeah. But moving on to therapeutics, because it's all very well making a diagnosis, but the diagnosis has got to mean something. I suppose it can help with in terms of advising a family genetically about the risk. But what about the role of amiodarone? Because I think you were quite interested in that area back then.
Yeah, so amiodarone was, I guess, in the late 70s, early 80s, disopyramide, late 70s, disopyramide was the leading market leader as an antiarrhythmic and actually an effective drug, but proarrhythmic and negative inotrope and usually not very well tolerated, particularly with men over the age of 50. And amiodarone came along, and we had very early access to it through Dennis Crickler and Robert Slama in Paris. And I remember we had a hypertroph patient, dilated cardiomyopathy patient, who was actually giving up his farm because of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation that just crippled him. And Slama told Dennis, we have this amiodarone. He sent me over to Paris, and I brought back amiodarone. I think it was July 1976, or it was mid-76. And this patient went on the amiodarone. We had no idea what the dose was. Mauricio Rosenbaum said it was a gram a day, which turned out to be about 5 times what you needed. But this man went on the amiodarone, and his paroxysmal AF stopped. He turned blue, and he wouldn't stop. We started him on 600 a day, and he refused to decrease the dose because he said, I don't care. I don't care if I'm blue. I haven't had to sell my farm. But so the amiodarone was particularly valuable for paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, and remains so. It's unfortunate that the way it was marketed in particularly in North America was on doses that were actually potentially toxic. And if at 100 milligrams a day, 200 milligrams a day, it's usually very effective. And so a bit like digoxin, the therapeutic levels are not it's levels of plasma levels to tell you where there's risk of toxicity. Exactly the same principles as digoxin. And if you run a plasma level of more than 1.5 milligrams per liter of the metabolite, you will get side effects. Usually 18 months more down the line. But that message never really, how we use the plasma levels and the accessibility to plasma levels and the proper use of amio never really took off, mainly in North America particularly. But it's still a very effective drug for paroxysmal atrial fibrillation.
And its use in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, are you? I guess we've got the new some new agents there.
Much so. Amio, good as an antiarrhythmic, particularly for supraventricular arrhythmias. But now we actually have new classes of drugs that have apparently a molecular basis to their mode of action. So it's exciting, and I don't think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of the myosin inhibitors. I think it takes you back to the arguments of the 60s about gradient. Is gradient obstruction, or is a systolic gradient is that just prolonged inefficient systolic contraction with near total emptying of the ventricle, or is it impaired early relaxation, or is it both? And you can make measurements of relaxation and say it's impaired relaxation. You can make measurements of systolic function, say it's prolonged, it's obstruction, ejection times and whatnot. And if you, and like most arguments, if you looked at the protagonists, which was, I suppose, Goodwin and Criley on one side and Weigel and Brownwald on the other, and all giants. And like most arguments that go a long way or go on a long time, both sides were right. So if you had a gradient of more than about 50 or 60, you had obstruction. And if you had a gradient of 30 to 50, you probably had a ventricle that completely emptied. And Joe Murgo showed that. Many people showed that. But the argument polarized. And now what we have is drugs that actually treat, the myosin inhibitors will treat that prolonged and efficient contraction. Or what are they treating? Is it relaxation or contraction? And I think there's a lot still to be understood about the myosin inhibitors right now.
Well, certainly
but
it's
exciting.
yeah, and sort of crossover with my special interest in heart failure, that a lot of these patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, as they go on, the heart failure becomes more and more the problem. And the fact that these myosin inhibitors are dropping the natriuretic peptide and apparently improving the heart failure status of these patients, is quite extraordinary, using a drug which actually impairs apparently systolic function to improve the heart failure state. It just, I suppose beta blockers in some senses do the same, but very interesting. Do you think do you have any predictions what the long-term effects of these drugs are going to be?
No, it's similarly with the gene therapy. It's exciting in that we're finally doing something other than symptomatic therapy that is apparently targeting more basic mechanisms or the fundamental mechanisms, the genetics. But I guess these are experiments still. There's a risk benefit. I don't think the risk is huge with the myosin inhibitors, but I think with the mavacamten been extremely cautious, and I think exciting with the aficamten data. And I think I think this is the beginning. I don't think this is. I think it's the start of understanding. I don't think the risks are significant with the gene therapy. There's a Danon trial. I'm not probably familiar with it, but about 20 some odd patients have received viral vector with promoter and the appropriate genetic sequence. And the preliminary stuff, I think it's 3 years plus now, is very positive with remodeling and beneficial without significant adverse effects. So again, this is promoted. A number of gene therapy companies that have licenses to go forward, and Tenaya Therapeutics has license to go forward with MYBPC3 truncations.
Okay, right. So we can actually attack the myosin problem with the gene therapy. So yeah. And
it's the risk benefit. So here, your question is about what's the risk. Well, gene therapy is a little bit different than a myosin inhibitor, and how do we
you can't take it away.
Exactly. How do we see? Well, we don't fully know what it's going to do. What happens if you put this new sequence into a myocyte, and what's it going to do? How is it going to be regulated? How will it operate? And the second problem is that how do we make sure that these are patients, and from a risk benefit, how do we make sure that these are people who are truly at risk of arrhythmia, heart failure complications in a reasonable time frame? That's a challenge.
And one of the comments at the moment is the horrendous cost of these agents. Do you have any great idea about how we can? Because obviously the people who have invested in this have to have a return on investment. We can't just complain about cost and not do something else otherwise we're going to kill innovation if we do that. But
and also the time it's taken. Particularly with the gene therapy. These companies are putting in 4 or 5 years with 150, 200 people of high quality scientists and individuals with no return, and it's probably another 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years before there's money coming back. So it's the cost and how they're marketed and brought to the public is going to be an issue. But I think if you have a product, I think societies have had ways of getting what was too expensive 5 years ago to people at costs that people can afford or society can afford. I think if we can get therapies that work, that's the challenge.
That's a good start. And of course, with drugs, at least, maybe not biologicals, etc., the patent will run out, and then generics will be available. But that's sad if we have to wait that long. We should have a better health regulation system. But anything else you want to tell us about in the pipeline? That you've told us about the gene therapy and the myosin inhibitors.
Well, I mean, in the pipeline, those are the only two major areas, but I'd go back to, I think the myosin inhibitors have been developed from a marketing, sort of pharmacological marketing standpoint, focusing on something you can focus on. Yes, there's obstruction. The gradient is the following. This is how it's measured and done, which is obvious from a clinical trial standpoint. But what exactly, I mean, there's too many odd things around who's responding. And it's back to Attilio's comment. Tell me about the one who didn't respond. I'm much more interested in him. And how is he different from the ones who do respond? Why are patients who fit the criteria not responding? And why do some patients who don't fit the criteria at all do respond? So I think there's more to it, and it comes back to the diastolic function, basically, which is a major problem. One of the things if you saw a HOCM patient, I'd always say, whatever we have, they come, they're frightened, they've been referred, and somebody scared the daylights out of them. They've gone on a website and they've read about sudden death and this and that. And you say, whatever we find is manageable. The only thing that isn't manageable is restrictive physiology. Everything else you can treat and largely succeed with, but obviously severe restrictive physiology you can't, and there's no drugs that have really done anything significant to that. So whether this is a class of a drug that will improve early relaxation and diastolic function is, for me, is a question that needs to be looked at.
Yeah. And then we need to think of the benefits that this research has had in terms of creating awareness of the condition, and therefore the number of physicians who see the patients, and therefore potentially the number of patients who are available not only for treatment but also for research. And one of the problems, I think, with amiodarone is we really haven't had large randomized controlled trials because nobody's assembled the cohorts, and maybe now we can sort of go back and look at some of the older treatments because the people are more aware of the patient group.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think there have been some studies, not fantastic studies, but the message from the studies that have been done is that roughly somewhere between 10 and 15% of patients with HCM get diagnosed, and that even in referral centers, about 10 to 15% actually get a gene test. So we're not using simple technologies of ECG echo, and we're not using the available genetics. And one of the things that these new genetically based therapies is driving is actually gene testing, which the message, if you read guidelines, is that indications for genetic testing is for cascade screening of the family. We'll find the gene in the proband and cascade screen of the family. But it's quite clear if you see families and you see enough patients that the genes have a prognostic value. And though I think one of the things that there was an early New England paper involving our families, and tried to sell a message, which is partially true, which is troponin T all by itself, mutations are sworn consideration of a defibrillator. And what we didn't realize that our patients were not selected, but they turned out to have mutations in alleles encoding amino acids 92 to 95. And if you have those amino acids, if you have a mutation there, you should be a serious consideration of an ICD. Whereas if you've got a 271 variant, you've got good prognosis. So we tried to look at, because we didn't have adequate data sets, we compared myosin to troponin to alpha tropomyosin. In actual fact, you've got to drill down to the specific mutation. And when you do that within myosin, within troponin, very definitely they're high-risk mutations. And if you look at myosin by MYBPC3, it doesn't appear that there are specific mutations that are high risk because they all cause haploinsufficiency. But if you've got a second variant, And that there's a registry, a recent registry that is mainly pediatric, but again, it was, I think, 95% 5-year survival without major problem. One variant, 68% 5-year survival without major adverse event. If you had an additional variant. So that there's a lot more in the genetics that we need to develop, but we haven't collectively, and that's part of its price. It's part of it rationed by governments, and people have been unwilling to pay for it, and it's been a problem.
Okay, I'm going to hand you back to Filippo, who's got a few more penetrating questions.
Bill, we have questions from the audience typically during these dialogues. I read a question from Shamanna Yenger, and the question is about septal ablation. Is still popular, should still be popular, or is over?
Nothing's over. We've just started. So we've just had a couple of trials with myosin inhibitors. One is beginning to be licensed, and a second probably will be at some point in the near future. But surgery, the conventional mechanisms of septal reduction therapy, be it myectomy or septal reduction, alcohol septal reduction, I think remain as major therapeutic options. The major problem with them both is that you actually need a high level of expertise. These shouldn't be done in just any cardiac center, and that's an issue. So you need to refer to centers of excellence. And with the myosin inhibitors, probably you will be able to administer these much more generally in general cardiology clinics with cardiologists with some background. But these are very, very much active therapies that are very important.
Thank you, Bill. On the top of the screen, I see three famous colleagues, Denis Clement, John Horowitz, and Jan Piek. Welcome to our dialogue. Do you have questions for Bill? You are not obliged, but if
I think John is
questions, you are very welcome.
Unmute him, I think.
Yeah,
Okay.
John, you are muted.
And to realise in much more detail than I ever had before how all of this came to being and how the conditions for mutation were set in place.
By serendipity.
That too.
It's the greatest driver in the universe, serendipity, I think.
Yes.
But it's the prepared mind. We should also say that it's the great idea with a prepared mind.
Yeah. Maybe a short question. What is currently, you talked about the cost, about the myosin inhibitors and about the future perspectives, how it should be on the market and the return on investment. But what at the moment are the costs per year for myosin inhibitors as compared to maybe other modes of therapy like septal ablation or surgery? What is the comparison?
Well, I can't really, the truth is I can't answer that question knowledgeably. It'll be different. I mean, the license for mavacamten is just being released at different times in different countries. It's not available in most European countries at present, or it's being made available. And the costs will depend a lot on the individual systems. I'm not sure what costs are in America, or even if it's fully available. The costs are not just the cost of the drug, mm-hmm. but it's the follow-up and the protocol that goes with the drug at present, which probably in 3 to 5 years we'll understand a little bit better how much we really need to do. But I think the approach that's been taken is better safe than sorry. There's a lot of echoes being done. There's a lot of follow-up that's been very close. But the true cost, I couldn't even begin to guess. But it's where the big problem will be is much. There's obviously a cost in the development that Myocardia and Bristol Myers, who bought Myocardia, and then Cytokinetics, who've developed aficamten. There's obviously costs there, but the gene therapy costs are much more significant, and the longer gestation time before you actually have a product that you can market, and what the cost there will be problematic, because it's not going to be a large number of patients that are available to or they'll be appropriate, at least in the beginning. But a very good question, but I'm afraid I'm not able to answer it properly, really.
Dennis, any comment from your side? Questions?
I was just wondering about the link between severe arrhythmias and cardiomyopathy. We always think, of course, it is the myocardial, we should take away what is possible to be removed and so on. But is the arrhythmia problem in those patients still progressing or not progressing, or do you just not worry really on this?
No, you you have to worry.
Yeah,
So
I think
a major component of the management, and I would always tell colleagues that, you know, in my time in cardiomyopathy, the first thing is the diagnosis correct? Yes or no? The next thing is, are they at risk of arrhythmia? And effectively, that largely means ICD, yes or no, unless it's supraventricular, but are they at risk of ventricular arrhythmia, sudden death? And that's ICD, yes or no? And then it's psychotherapy from family, risk to everybody. And now there's potential new options that are at least optimistic, but the arrhythmia is a very important component of sudden death, syncope, sudden death, stroke risk, AF risk, embolic risk. So arrhythmia is central to the management.
thank you.
Bill, we have another question from a colleague in the audience, Gavin Audit. And the question,
let's ask.
I read.
Or does Gavin want to give it?
Are you there? Oh, yes,
Yeah,
please.
great.
Yeah, please
Yeah,
ask your
great.
question directly.
And absolutely. So, and thank you, Professor McKenna. So it's great to hear your story, and I think so much of that is important for our young colleagues now. I think hopefully it does not get lost in translation. So thank you for that. I work with assignments now. As you know, we are doing a lot of the single cell, single nuke RNA-seq, and a lot of cardiomyopathies, and so that history was just wonderful. So my question was about the genetics of cardiomyopathy in general, but particularly hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, despite our whole, all the way from panel, but all the way to whole exome, whole genome sequence. We can only define about 1 in 3 of our patients with a genetic cause. What's happening with the other 2/3 of our patients? Is this undiagnosed hypertension? Is there some polygenic factors coming into play?
Good question. So, I mean, good question. And if it's a good question, it's difficult to answer. But I think there are multiple things. So, yeah, I think we have to accept that sarcomere mutations with a normal panel will account for maybe be somewhere between 30 and maybe 40%, but say 30, 40%. Then you get the polygenic risk, and which is ostensibly identifying another proportion. But when you look at the patients that have been involved in the polygenic risk studies, which come from big gene banks and big data banks, they don't sound like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients. If you go back and look at NIH, Hammersmith, any of the Toronto, Zurich, any of the big hospital groups with hypertrophs, 60-40 male, wall thickness 2.2 to 2.2, left atrial dimension 46, 25% a gradient with more than 30 millimeters of mercury, 25% non-sustained VT. These patients in these registries that are being used for polygenic risk are in their late 50s. Wall thickness is 18, 19. And basically, and majority of them have obesity, diabetes, hypertension. So we're finding markers for associated features which are not rare in hypertrophic. If most centers will have 20 to 30% of hypertrophs also have hypertension, but there's a problem with the diagnosis, and that's part of the problem. The other problem is that we're still using Walter Henry in 1978, or something like that, proposed asymmetric septal hypertrophy as the genetically determined pathogenomic feature of the disease. Well, and that he was linked to the NIH, Chester Clark, Steve Epstein, and that was published. And even with 2D echo, we moved away from M mode, which was ASH, which is the thickest. You can measure the thickest and thinnest segments of the myocardium on the M mode echo. With 2D, you can see the whole ventricle. So we got rid of the ASH, but we kept the 1.5 centimeters. Well, the idea that one measurement at one part of the ventricle provides a diagnostic criteria for a disease, for a condition that causes hypertrophy throughout the ventricle. So 9 millimeters at the apex is abnormal. 1.5 at the basal septum probably, so it wasn't a criticism of Walter Henry, that probably was correct at that. But when you move down the ventricle, size is important, the body surface area, size, and where in the ventricle you're making the measurement. So we have adopted kind of mindlessly for 50 years the same criteria that was accepted in 1978. And I think we need to be looking much more critically at our diagnostic criteria. Now, to what extent, going back to your question, that explains some of the negative gene testing, I don't know, but there's a bunch of things. But another one is if you then look, you know, what's emerging is actually intermediate variants, like alpaca 3, FHOD3, and these all seem, when you read the paper, oh, it's 1%, 2%, but also there's 10 of these intermediate variants. And that comes up to 20% when you do sort of 10 times 2. And to what extent are those important? I think the genetic testing needs to broaden out a little bit. So I think it's multifactorial, but I think that probably the data is correct that somewhere between 30 and 40% have a sarcomeric variant or mutation. But there's other factors related, and part of it's diagnosis, part of it's the genetic testing.
Right, thank you so much.
I can see that we've got some questions from Enrique Sanchez. Should we?
Enrique, please, you can ask yourself.
Oh, thank you. Good morning. Pleased to see you, to meet with you. I have a question, Professor McKenna. In a country like ours with limited resources, is there any? We have SGLT2 inhibitors. They are accessible, not cheap, but accessible. And we have the classical amiodarone. Is there any role for these two medicines in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy?
So where are you calling from?
Nicaragua, Managua.
I was going to say, because you said good morning. I'm sitting here in the dark.
No.
Okay.
Bill, this is a global thing.
Okay. So can we go back to the caller? So I see him, but it doesn't matter. But so your question was about agents and cost. The original amiodarone story actually comes from Maurizio Rosenbaum, who used it in Chagas disease in the early 1970s. And he used it in very high doses. In fact, his registrar who published it was Juan Carlos Caschi, who's Juan Pablo's father, who's a cardiologist that worked with Filippo. It's particularly, I think amiodarone is particularly valuable in low dose for what is probably the most difficult management problem in HCM, which is the paroxysmal supraventricular arrhythmias. So there's one, and again, it comes from your side of the world in terms of time zones originally. I have no experience of what was the other drug you mentioned? Sorry.
Dapagliflozin or empagliflozin is
I can't comment knowledgeably. I've never used them in that context, so I can't comment. But amiodarone is off license. It's cheap, and it's very effective for supraventricular arrhythmias, which are a major part of the problem in terms of management.
Bill, what is your dose, your amiodarone dose? What do you suggest? A small loading dose, 600 a week for a week. Depends a little bit on the patient and the context, but in general, 600 for a week, and then 200 thereafter for maybe a month. But then you want the lowest effective dose. And so you basically titrate, rather than titrating up, you titrate down. Well, you get an efficacy, and then you titrate down once you have efficacy. But usually you can succeed with 200 milligrams a day for any supraventricular arrhythmias. And we've been talking about amiodarone. Amiodarone is not certainly in North America. It's not used that much in this context.
A lot of the noise about amiodarone came from a very small trial where we published, I can't remember what we compare. I think we may have compared it to verapamil, but in effect, there was a survival benefit for the use of low-dose amiodarone for sudden death prevention. But if you'd had 2 people who survived die suddenly, that you wouldn't have had a survival benefit. So this was a very small trial. In today's standards, this would not have passed muster. It would have been seen as perhaps pilot data to look at. I would clearly there are problems if you use amiodarone in higher dose, and clearly it's not a panacea. And in the modern world, if you think someone's at risk of sudden death from ventricular arrhythmias, the ICD is the therapy. If you're still having discharge inappropriate or not inappropriate, if you're having appropriate therapies, amio is a reasonable drug to add. It's a membrane stabilizer. It actually will have some lower VF thresholds, raised VF thresholds, etc. One of the things, Filippo, slightly anecdote, but when we were doing the dog experiments, the dog when they were doing some coronary occlusion, and the dogs kept dying. And of course, we'd book the positron, the machine, we'd get the isotopes, but if the dog died, it ruined the whole day and the experiment. It was costly. And Andrew Selwyn said to me, he called me Thrill. He said, Thrill, he said, what, this amiodarone you're talking about, does it do anything? I said, well, he said, we're going to give it to the dogs. How much should we give? Sort of like your question. I don't remember what I said, but we gave the dogs about a week of amiodarone beforehand. And the dogs, I don't remember, but the dogs that were dying out of 10, now 8 out of 10 survived the experiment. But I remember Roger Allen bringing the dog heart to count the microspheres. And this dog heart sat on the bench while we were drinking our Rioja, which Andrew referred to as Old Woody, which on a Friday afternoon. And this dog heart was sitting there beating away at least half an hour after it, or whatever it was, after we left the positron lab, and after Andrew or Roger Allen had sacrificed the animal. So.
Bill, you have a wonderful crystal ball. It worked in the past. When genes came up, you've been one of the first to really identify their value. What you see in your crystal ball today? What will be the next breakthrough in this field? Better risk stratification, new drugs, new strategies? What do you see in your crystal ball? I know it works very well.
I mean, I have a degree of frustration in that I think we've had things available to us. I think we haven't used the genetic information that's available. We haven't used the technologies appropriately. We don't, even major clinics for financial reasons don't do genetic testing. And I think we don't have the size data sets. So one of the things I've had access as an advisor to Health and Codes database, which has a huge number. It's got 45,000 gene tests, and you can begin to look at survival from this mutation versus that mutation within troponin or myosin or whatever, and it's quite clear that there's genetic information that we're not using on a prognostic basis to identify risk in particular, and not just risk of arrhythmias, but risk of heart failure and atrial fibrillation and stroke. So for me, that it's actually promoting the use of technologies that we have. And I think it's happening. And I think the myosin inhibitor story in particular has been valuable, because all of a sudden it's inhibiting myosin, and the genetic background of this is probably important. And again, that hasn't been properly looked at. And then there's the gene therapy. So for me, getting much more genetic basis to our evaluation of patients and ultimately to their therapies. But I think we're, on a pathway of 1 to 10, we're only somewhere between 1 and 2. But the potential is there, and it's, I guess it's just money largely.
It's usual. Bill, we have the last question from our audience, Golsa Tabata Bay. Golsa, please, can you ask your question?
Good afternoon. Actually, I have several questions. The first one is, could this HCM be totally a non-genetic related disease? I mean, Could it be just totally from an underlying problem or disorder or even disease that is causing this genetic, changes, and actually the cardiomyocytes are compensating to the low strength of the cardiomyocyte, and could it be this way?
Yeah, a difficult question so you're reflecting, I think we sort of have pigeonholed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy diagnosed by 1.5 centimeters thickness, and then we do genetics and we have sarcomeric genes, but we also know that there's other syndromes from Friedreich's ataxia to Noonan syndrome, to some of the storage diseases, AMP kinase, mitochondrial disease. So there are other genetic causes. But I think what you're asking is, could this thickness just be a compensation for some other failure? Or if that's what you're asking, and I think, you can look and say, take the athlete as an example. The athlete will perform, and that will exercise the heart. And if you exercise your biceps, they get bigger. If you exercise your triceps, they get bigger. If you exercise your heart, it gets bigger. The magnitude of the increase in muscle thickness is such that it's probably outside of what 99.9% of athletes will develop. And certainly, the extreme for an athlete might be 1.6 centimeters. So I think, in answer to your question, it depends on what level. If you're, can the ventricle hypertrophy in a small female from 1 to 1.3 centimeters in relation to hypertension or exercise or some other stimulus? Probably. But when you get up into the diagnostic criteria that have been used for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, I don't think so. I think there's other syndromes, there's other conditions with genetic basis, and I've mentioned some of them, but I don't think that aortic valve disease, hypertension, the athlete will do that. And one of the problems with hypertension is that it's common, and it's not particularly well treated in many areas. So you can see a hypertroph who also has hypertension, and probably 25, if you look in most of the published series, it's always between 20 and 30% of hypertrophs also have systemic hypertension. Not sure if I answered your question, but I tried.
It was not an easy question, I agree. Bill, we invite to our dialogues top scientists like you, but we are curious not only about science, but also about the human side of our guest. And you spent some time in Qatar. Can you tell us about your human and scientific experience in Qatar?
That's a tricky question. So
the one before was
first of all, I enjoyed it. People thought, oh, he's going to Qatar for money. I actually went there because I didn't want to retire, but I had to retire for logistical reasons. I wanted to keep busy, and somebody offered me an interesting job to be the chief executive of a heart hospital and medical director. And when I had my interview with the minister, I said, I've never managed more than 30 people, and now I'm managing 1,300. I need help. So I can give you a strategy. I can give you a research approach. I can run MDTs and motivate clinicians. I can help recruit, but I need managers. I'm not a manager. And so they said, no, we'll get you people from the National Health System, make it work. And that component worked. The people were very capable, and there's about 250,000 Qataris and about 2 million workers, other people who come in to do everything from being scientists, technicians, to being taxi drivers and cleaners, and that era was construction, getting ready for the World Cup. The people, my closest friends, were over the age of 80. They were people who made Qatar great. They were former president or CEO of Qatar Petroleum, and they grew up on compounds in the desert. They learned languages. They never went to school. And my favorite and closest friend was the former CEO, and he started as the tea boy at Shell and became CEO. And he said he grew up in the desert. He worked on every one of, how did he work his way up to be CEO? He worked on every one of the Shell areas in Nigeria and the Delta and Maracaibo and different oil areas. And he said the first time he had to go as CEO to the Shell meeting in New York, and he said everybody was presenting. They all went to Harvard Business School. He says, I never went to school. And he said they all spoke English. I never learned English. English is about my fifth language. But he said, but I know the oil business. I've lived on oil rigs. I've slept on the barge to bring the oil in from the out so they didn't get stolen on the way to the tanks. He said, I know the oil business. They know the balance sheet, but I know the oil business. And he this kind of character and his friends, I had the privilege of being with them. They respect positions. So being the CEO of a hospital was quite helpful. They assumed that I could sort out anything, which sometimes you could, but you couldn't always, certainly not some of the health problems they had. But they were wonderful people. And working there was in that aspect was wonderful. The other thing is, when people always said, John Goodwin or other people said, why do you come from Montreal to London? And I would say Montreal is 300 miles from nowhere. London's 300 miles from everywhere. But if you've lived in London for 45 years, to go to Qatar, all of a sudden there's a new everywhere. And so traveling, because the wives said family life is important. And Nancy, my wife, was not enamored of being the expat wife, going to brunches on Saturdays and camel racing on Tuesdays. So she would come, but we'd do a day or two, but then we would travel in Uzbekistan and Jordan and the Oman. And there was fantastic access to places. And it was another level of travel and people that we never would have encountered. So I thoroughly enjoyed the people. COVID ended a lot of things. The approach to COVID came at a downturn in the economy, and there was a sort of propaganda war between Saudi, the sort of realignment in the Gulf with the Saudis, Kuwait, UAE against Iran, and there's little Qatar sitting there. There's Iran on one side of the Gulf. It's like Calais and Dover. There's the other side of the Arabian Sea is Iran, and the economy of Qatar is gas. Okay, and the gas fields are shared with Iran. So you cannot become too aggressive with the Iranians over the shared gas field, which is your economy. Whereas Iran is a much bigger country with many more. So the politics around all of this, and to listen to it, and were fascinating to me, just to be part of. I mean, I could go on, but one of the things was when this propaganda war with the Saudis started, all of a sudden the Qatar Rial was pegged to the US dollar at 3.65, and this propaganda war started, and they closed the border, and 40% of the good of everything, food, everything came across the Saudi border into Qatar. And they closed the border. So there was sort of panic buying. And one of the things that changed was the currency went 3.65, 3.68, it went up to 3.82. And I realized, not that the money wasn't a big issue, but I realized my salary was being devalued sort of by about 2% a day. I said, what's going to happen? This is going to cause chaos in the society. And my friend said, oh, don't worry, it'll get fixed. I said, well, how's it going to get fixed? Oh, he said, the guy who's the minister who's in charge of this, he's been away on holiday, but he's coming back on Sunday and he'll fix it. So he just bought a couple of $1 billion worth of Qatar Rials, and all of a sudden it went down to 3.65. So then I thought, that's good. Then about 3 months later, the whole thing started again. Somebody was selling short the Qatar Rial. And so I said to my friend again, who was the former CEO I said, what's going on, Ahmed? And he said, don't worry. He said, the boss has been away. His wife's been sick. She's in London, but he comes back tomorrow. And he said, it'll go back to normal. So yes, all of a sudden back to 3.65. I said, is this going to keep happening? And this little smile, he said, no. He said, he said, we're very rich. And he said, we have very deep pockets. And he said, there's only 250,000 of us. And he said, in Saudi, there's 25 million. So he said, they too can play the game. So if we start selling short their currency, we can outlast them. And he said, they know that, and that we've done just enough that they're going to stop doing this. So this is like sort of the kind of thing that, because of the people I was with, I listened to the sort of the propaganda going on between in the press, but was actually listening on a daily basis to what was actually happening between mainly Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And it affected currency, it affected transportation. All of a sudden, we had a dairy industry. Germany sent 400 cows a month, and all of a sudden you could buy Qatar yogurt, Qatar cream, Qatar milk, Qatar butter, the same hydroponic fruit and vegetables. So they were amazing, and it's amazing what you can do with money. But they had planned this. They knew they'd been caught 2 or 3 years ago by not being prepared, and on this occasion they were prepared for what the Saudis did. And so all of a sudden you had a deep water port being developed, you had a dairy industry, you had fruit and vegetables, you had a year's worth of pharmaceutical supplies. They knew this was happening, but it was fascinating.
Thank you, Bill, for sharing with us this very interesting experience. Next time you'll go there, they will propose you to become prime minister, perhaps.
No.
Minister of Finance, by the sound of it.
Based on this massive experience. John, we have time for a last question from you, a last comment.
Well, just it's been wonderful to renew our acquaintance. If I'd known that you were in London, I would have joined you in your at your house, and we could have done it live. So yeah, I just want to say, I've learned so much from you over the years. I do remember our time at the Hammersmith, where we were getting those very first genes in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. A little bit of competition between the Brompton and the Hammersmith at that time, I think. And yeah, it's been a great pleasure. And if you see Ed Rowland around, I always, whenever I think of you, I always think of Ed. I think at one time you were almost inseparable at the hip.
Yeah.
But yeah, great to see you again.
Bill, one question from my side. I always ask these questions to all our guests. How can we improve our dialogues? Suggestions for what we can do better?
Are you familiar with desert island discs?
Not so much, I'm afraid.
No. Okay. Well, in the UK, it's gone on for probably 30 years, but there's more. A very skilled interviewer interviews somebody has accomplished something, and they ask this individual. They ask them questions about their background, their careers, and to choose, I think it's 10 discs, 10 songs that they would like to promote, that then you pay maybe 20 seconds or 30 seconds of that song. And at the end, they have to choose one that they take to a desert island. And they get to take that to the desert island, and they can take, I think it's the Bible and Shakespeare, a volume, and one other book. But you can't take anything practical to the desert island with you. But the quality of this comes down to the interviewer. And another one is, I think it's called Up to History, but anyway, podcasts where you listen, the rest is history, and you listen to two people who have expertise. And I think the dialogue, this was pretty good because John, but partly because we know each other going back almost 50 years, 40 something. And John, I was a senior registrar at the Hammersmith, and John succeeded me, I think in 87 or so. The quality comes down to the dialogue between who's being interviewed and what the people know about that person. And those two, the rest is history, is fantastic because you get somebody who knows about it, but is interviewing somebody who is particularly, he usually has a vested interest, a vested opinion. But it's a fantastic podcast. And Desert Island is not quite analogous, but it's the knowledge of the person doing the interviewing is very important in creating a dialogue, which we did.
So thank you. I'm going to reinterpret that as perhaps we should be doing the dialogues with a tandem.
Well,
two people working in the same area.
Yeah. No, it's but and we fortunately we have in many ways. So it's not. you know, but it would say having somebody who's a CMR expert being interviewed by an arrhythmologist is probably, you know, whereas we have much more synergy in terms of that historical background, in terms of where we work, the people we worked with, and what you do, what I've done.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for this wonderful hour. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, John, for joining us for this dialogue. Thank you, all of you, for the fascinating conversation. And I can anticipate that the next dialogue will be, as usual, on the last Thursday of the month. And next dialogue, Bill, will be with John Dinfield. So back to Hammersmith also.
Exactly.
Month, I will host him with Peter Libby. So
Good.
it will be another fascinating dialogue. Thank
Well,
you.
it should be a good
again.
combination.
Sorry, what, Bill?
Should be a good combination. Peter Libby.
Yeah, it will be a wonderful combination. If you have time, Bill, please join us. Also,
I'll see John next weekend.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. We'll stay in touch.
Thank you. Thanks, John.